My name is Henry Hale. I'm Professor of Political Science and International Affairs here at the Elliott School and the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, and also Director of PONARS Eurasia. So welcome. I just wanted to say a few words just about what this event is. PONARS Eurasia itself is a network of leading mid-career and rising scholars, primarily based in North America and post-Soviet countries. But also we have representatives in different parts of other parts of the world, in Europe in particular. And it has several goals of the network. I mean, part of it, of course, is to help build ties among experts on a professional basis that can withstand the test of all kinds of current events that, as we've seen, unfortunately, in this region, have tended to cause rifts even in families. And so I think I'm very proud of how well this network has held together, despite having representatives across all these post-Soviet countries, despite tensions among them. And so we've tried to maintain ties on a very professional, collegial basis, which I think helps us all improve our own understanding of events. But the core mission of PONARS is to encourage academics, people who are primarily based in scholarly research, to relate their findings to policy concerns, to practical concerns that people who are actually trying to impact the world have. So not so much about theory, but to try and encourage people to engage with policymakers and people in the professional communities about these issues with the idea of understanding, reaching better understanding. So one of the very important purposes of this conference is to connect the scholars who are part of the network with you. And so you as representatives of the broader Washington community, and so we've structured it such that we want to leave plenty of time for discussion. And I'll just say at the outset that in the discussion portions of the panel after the panelists have spoken, we welcome not just questions, but also comments, but we just ask that you keep any comments very brief and concise, because we have a lot of people, a lot of voices here that we want to recognize and hear. Another peculiarity of this conference, which I think makes it interesting, is that we ourselves, as kind of the directors of PONARS Eurasia, don't drive the agenda of this particular event, other than to say, we want an event that touches on the most important policy concerns of the region. Instead, we let our members do the determine for us what's important to be studied. And so we haven't invited people to talk on any particular topic. Instead, what we do is we issue a general invitation to members, and so they tell us what they think is important about the research or the policy area in which they're conducting research. And so that I think produces an interesting set of voices that maybe not everything fits together in a perfectly coherent panel, but I think these are some of the most important concerns that are bubbling up from the people who have their feet on the ground and have been doing, looking into these issues for long periods of time. So I want to thank a number of people before we get going, of course. First of all, I want to thank Carnegie Corporation of New York, which is our principal funder. So without their help, we wouldn't be able to do all that we've been able to do. Of course, a big thanks goes to IRES and the Elliott School and George Washington University, so the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, which also contributes a large amount of financial as well as other human and physical resources to the PONARS Eurasia program. In particular, I'd like to thank my longtime co-director and who was even working with PONARS before it moved to GW, Corey Welt, who has now moved on to the Congressional Research Service. But obviously, his work before even starting that job has been essential to the success of this conference. So I would urge all of you to thank him as well for this. So we're very grateful for his work and continued interest in all of the things that we were doing. I'd like to thank Sasha Schmemann, our managing editor for the publications that we work on. And I should say that most of the presentations here will then later be part of policy memos that we'll be publishing and releasing on our website. So your feedback will also be helpful in helping the authors develop their ideas to finalize their products, although some of them have already been published. We've already started the publication series, so a few have already been published that you'll see. I want to thank Eileen Jorns, who is basically kind of managing the whole, all the logistics related to this conference, which for a large international conference flying in dozens of people, you can imagine is quite an impressive task to take care of. And then we have a large number of volunteers who have generously donated their time. And then finally, I'd like to introduce Dr. Peter Rolberg, who is the director of IRES, and so of course it's been very, just absolutely essential to the program's not only success, but very existence. So we're very grateful for his support. So he'll say a few words of welcome, and then he'll turn things over to me as I chair the first panel. So Peter, thank you.
Good morning, dear colleagues. For the first time I spoke here, the opening of PONARS 4 years ago, and I remember I flattered the attendants saying that I was really amazed by the vibrancy and the vivaciousness of the intellectual dialogue that I could observe in PONARS. And I want to add that Henry, who was actually my predecessor as director, he was director until 2012, he brought PONARS here. And when he sent out the first message saying, I'd like to introduce PONARS Eurasia, and this will be a great addition to our intellectual life at IRES and so on, I really did not know what he was talking about and what kind of consequences this step would have. And then when I saw firsthand how this actually stimulated the dialogue, the discourse in our institute, I couldn't but admire his vision and his insight in how he actually managed to get us this organization that was already reputable at the time, and made it one of the main components of the institute, of the Elliott School. And of course, the annual conference is really one of the major events, not just for PONARS, but also for our institute. So I asked myself, how come that this is such a lively organization? How come that it's able to rejuvenate itself? And one of the answers that I came up with is that it combines tenured faculty, research grant-supported faculty, and practitioners, and I think this is really one of the keys to success in the field of international affairs. And I say this coming from the tenured faculty side, and as a former department chair, when you're confronted with this constant problem of how can you stimulate tenured faculty who now are tenured and really don't have to engage very much in research if they don't want to, how can you actually stimulate for them to be engaged? And I think that organizations, the presence of organizations such as PONARS really can play a very stimulating and key role in that. PONARS Eurasia, that was founded some 20 years ago at Harvard's Davis Center for Russian Studies by Celeste Wallander, then still named Program on New Approaches to Russian Security, has maintained this vibrancy. And I want to say that 20 years, it's approximately 20 years. I don't know when exactly, I couldn't find the exact date of when this organization was founded, but it's a reason to congratulate the participants, and I'm not sure if anybody is here who was there 20 years ago. Amazing. Okay. we need to conduct some oral history and some interviews about how this all started, with what goals, and so on and so on. Yeah, it's Arkady Moshes, actually. Yes. So I just want to say this one person here. But it seems to me that it really would make sense to actually try a historical critical analysis of the history of PONARS and look at how it started, with what goals, what vision, what ideas, and how these ideas and how these goals were transformed in the course of these past 2 decades, what actually turned out to be a success, what turned out to be maybe an illusion or even a failure, and why. And so I can only say this would be a very worthwhile undertaking to look at PONARS historically as an institution from an institutional history point of view. So before I return the floor to Henry, I would like to wish all of us a thought-provoking and productive conference. And I would like to ask you to join me in giving a round of applause to Corey Welt and to Henry, who actually impersonate what I said before. One is a tenured faculty member, the other is or was a grant-supported researcher, and there couldn't have been a better combination of two personalities and two administrative approaches than these two. So thank you very much and congratulations on these accomplishments with PONARS Eurasia.
All right, thank you, Peter. So I think without further ado, we will dive right into the substantive discussion. The first panel is on Russia's 2016 parliamentary elections. And we'll be going basically in the order that people are seated. So we'll start with Vladimir Gelman of European University of St. Petersburg, followed by Tomila Lankina of London School of Economics. Then we'll go to Regina Smyth of Indiana University, and bringing us home will be Nikolay Petrov of Higher School of Economics, Moscow. So we've asked each speaker to speak for about 10 minutes, and then after the speakers have finished, we'll open things up for discussion. So please, take it away, Vladimir.
Morning to everybody. Our panel will be devoted to analysis of various dimensions of recent State Duma elections in Russia, and upon my overview, then presenters will focus on some particular dimensions of this event. If we compare what happens in Russia last Sunday with the previous State Duma elections, we'll observe a sharp contrast. 5 years ago, State Duma elections were widely portrayed as fraudulent. They were perceived as fraudulent. They caused furious reaction of many Russians, and triggered the wave of anti-regime mobilization, popular protests. And 5 years later, we observe somewhat different picture. Elections were fraudulent. However, a major part of Russians did not react, or even did not appear at the polling stations. So why it happens and what it means? I would say that this change was a result of what I called as correction of errors, also learning from some lessons by Russia's rulers. And actually, my policy memo tend to focus on certain elements of this learning, or what I called as a restoring of authoritarian equilibrium. Why and how the Kremlin was able to restore a status quo and even improve its position vis-a-vis previous elections. Here is a nice picture from the media, which demonstrated the breakdown of seats in the State Duma. And you see that United Russia, the major pro-government party, got more than 2/3 of seats, while its satellites occupied rest of positions. United Russia is covered by blue, and it sounds like an outstandingly successful performance. However, if we have a look on numbers, we see that in terms of votes, it was a slight improvement vis-a-vis 2011 elections. United Russia got just 5% higher than it was 5 years ago. While in terms of seats, the picture is different, and this is because of shift from proportional electoral system to mixed electoral system, which benefited United Russia greatly. And almost half of its seats was obtained through single mandate districts, while just a handful of seats were designated to other parties. So what Kremlin did over these 5 years, I briefly outlined it as a 3D approach based on three major components. One is demobilization of voters and demobilization and depoliticization of the Russian society as a whole. The second is destruction, use of various forms of pressure, intimidation, and coercion towards Kremlin's rivals and towards Russian society as a whole. And disinformation, the efficient use of various media manipulations across the country. My co-panelist Tomila Lankina will say a little bit about these dimensions. So actually, 5 years ago, the interest to politics was very high. Elections were discussed in the media, and the use of anti-regime mobilization was relatively successful during the polls and after the polls. 5 years on, the picture is different. People were demobilized, and this demobilization also was endorsed by institutional changes, since elections were scheduled from December to mid-September, apparently not the best time for many Russians, and the campaign was rather sluggish and not attracted much attention. But also change in electoral system was coincided with very efficient manipulation with participants. Even though the number of parties running elections doubled vis-a-vis what we observed 5 years ago, but many of these parties were under strong pressure. Some of politicians were excluded from competition or heavily discredited, and this fine-tuning strategy of control brought certain benefits. Distraction was based upon what I called as the politics of fear, and the use of pressure toward all organizations which to some extent took part in the previous wave of anti-regime mobilization, such as NGOs, such as media, such as independent agencies like Levada Center, the major pollster, which was blamed and labeled as foreign agent just before the day of polls. Also, very systematic toughening of legal regulations, intimidation and violence provided an atmosphere which was hardly conducive for any independent activism, let alone anti-regime mobilization. And of course, the state control over the media greatly increased of these people. One should take into account that it was also a coincidence with increasing economic problems of Russia. And it left the Kremlin without strong possibilities of buying loyalty. Actually, the government simply have no money to increase social spendings, and this is why the previous strategy of co-optation, which was to some extent successful in the 2000s, but not much in 2010s. So the strategy of co-optation was replaced by the strategy of coercion. However, surveys demonstrated that public mood began to change. Less and less Russians were keen about their president. People were more and more critical about current state of affairs in the country, as you can see from from polling days. In the Russian public discourse, this disjuncture between media and reality was always described as a struggle between TV set and the fridge. You see very nice picture on TV set, but when you open the fridge, you realize that it's almost empty. So after annexation of Crimea, TV set apparently won. However, the recent trends in the public opinion demonstrated that the fridge strike back, but slowly and inconsistently, and certainly there was no major signs of public protest. So this was an atmosphere of 2016 elections, and the major outcome of these elections was very low voter turnout. Even official data demonstrated less than 50% turnout, but some analysts argued that the turnout was heavily inflated, and the data from big cities demonstrated that even the official turnout was about 1/3, which is quite stark contrast with previous experience. So, conceptualizing in social science terms, it seems that Russian voters switched from voice, from active protest to exit, to non-participation, to political apathy, passive adaptation, and so on. Okay, this is why we not expect major post-election protests, and the question is what will come next. Some people argue that it may be continuity of reshuffling of the government, reform of coercive apparatus and the like. Some people told that we may expect adoption of the new constitution and early presidential elections. Remain to be seen, but let me stop at the moment and give the floor to other partners. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll be picking up on some of the themes that Volodya has already highlighted. Now, many of you who are looking at this image on the slide will have recognized that these are the December 2011, the winter 2011-2012 dramatic electoral protests that accompanied the fraudulent State Duma and subsequently presidential elections in 2011 and 2012. And many of us are wondering why we are not seeing these kinds of protests in the current elections now. So I'll be picking up on Vladimir's kind of notion of correction of errors to understand what has the regime done to avoid this thing happening in these. So I propose to answer this question about what did the regime do right to secure this popular passivity by proposing two possible angles we could look at regime strategies and kind of regime survival. One is to highlight its vulnerabilities, and we know there are many vulnerabilities at present in terms of socioeconomic shocks, potential socioeconomic discontent, and even elements of electoral uncertainty, because we know there's been fraud in these elections as a means of dealing with this uncertainty. But another possible policy lens of looking at regime strategies is its remarkable adaptability to the public mood, specifically, not just a capacity to mold it, and not just the capacity to use repression, and also capacity to make very quick tactical shifts in response to developments on the ground, most notably public discontent, not just at home, but also abroad. So this particular angle of adaptability that I take is based on two sets of data that my colleagues at LSE and I have been analyzing. One is the data on popular protests. We are analyzing the dynamics of popular protests for a number of years, leading up all the way up to these current recent elections. And the second set of data is media data. We're trying to analyze how the state skillfully manages popular discontent by using media manipulation strategy. And perhaps that will go some way towards explaining the passivity that we've observed. So I start my presentation of these data with a very simple graph, which is not going to come as a surprise to those of us who are following popular protests in Russia. And these data are based on the Namarsh-Ru website, which is run by the political opposition figure, Garry Kasparov, rather funded by it. And this will not come as a surprise to seasoned observers of Russian politics if you see that the trend from 2012, which is when we had the peak of mobilizations, all the way to the present, the start of this year, is a downward trend. So how did the regime achieve this? And it's not just due to repression, which we know has been happening against political opposition activists who were staging these protests. But let's look at the media manipulation component of this strategy as well. Here's a simple graph, and it's based on sophisticated algorithms that my colleagues at LSE and I have kind of developed. But I will give you the very simple, in a nutshell, kind of description of these data. So we've created a dictionary of Russian language dictionary of use of words related to popular protest. Now, there are two possible ways you can characterize possible popular protest. One is in terms of violence, chaos, disorder, and another in terms of popular right to protest, rights that citizens in any democracy ought to enjoy. So if you're looking at this line and seeing that it's high up, that means the media framing protest in terms of democratic right to protest. In other words, in a nice way. And if you see that the line goes down, like here on this part of the graph, that means it's media framing protest in terms of violence, chaos, disorder, really awful and bad things. So what we see here is these spikes of media coverage of protests, and we're talking about state-controlled media. 3 state-controlled newspapers, Komsomolskaya Pravda, Izvestia, and Rossiyskaya Gazeta, and 3 major TV channels watched by lots and lots of ordinary Russians. So what we see is the winter 2011-2012 mobilizations are actually framed relatively positively. The media are responding to the public mood in a nice way, and they're not framing protests as this awful thing that's bad for Russia, that's going to lead to another revolution. But when Putin gets reelected to power, to the presidency, and then Bolotnaya disturbances happen in Bolotnaya Square in Russia, where skirmishes with the police and protesters happen, we see this dramatic plunge in this trend line. That is, the media start to frame protests in a very negative way, and this spike in coverage of protests here in October, the fall of 2012, is actually when the Russian state media propaganda machine decided to fabricate stories about protests and create this so-called documentary called Anatomy of Protest. It's a whole series, and they showed it on TV. Lots of media reproduced these stories. It was about alleged plots to unseat the regime, funded by Western agents, etc. So we see the media kind of really projecting these kind of images of protest, something in a way, by way of massaging and manipulating public opinion. And then we have this interesting spike in protest on this part of the chart here in October 2013. And if you're not following Russian politics very closely, you're wondering, what is this October 2013? What happened then? It's not yet the Euromaidan, because that's happening in November, later on that year. So these protests, which are, as you see on this chart, are not framed very negatively, and they don't follow with the same kind of plunge in the trend line as we see here. In other words, they're not followed by this aggressive negative framing of discontent. These are the Birylova ethnic riots that happened when an ethnically Russian man was murdered by an Azeri trader. And these riots and violence that followed were very nasty and ugly in nature. They were accompanied by slogans, Russia for Russians, Moscow for Muscovites, foreigners go home, etc. And in all fairness, many state channels, state newspapers in Russia did faithfully cover the vandalism and report the vandalism and violence that was happening at the time. But the TV channels in particular, the major 2 channels, TV 1 and Russia 1 channels, they actually sided with the protesters and really stigmatized the migrants. And the conclusion that I draw from it is in line with other scholars who have analyzed how Russia decides to use its propaganda machine at that time to tap into kind of Russian nationalist sentiment. And they do so starting with the beginning of 2012, which is when those protests, anti-regime protests, were occurring, because the regime realizes that in those protests, the liberal opposition walked side by side with the nationalist elements, and Navalny is one of the kind of patriotic figures that is kind of comes to mind in that sense. So they decide to cleverly manipulate public opinion in way to get support for the regime by kind of siding with nationalist, xenophobic elements in Russian public opinion, while stigmatizing democratic expressions of public discontent. And we know that happens just a few weeks before the Euromaidan starts. So these techniques of manipulating public opinion, leveraging nationalist sentiment, while really stigmatizing democratic popular protest, they were tried and tested on Russian soil before we move on to Euromaidan. So what happens with Russian media, the coverage of these Ukraine events? So on these charts, I have created, this is just based on simple word count of all media stories on protest, and we are counting the words that were occurring frequently in Russian media's depiction of Euromaidan. And in this part of the analysis, I'm also using state and independent media, including Ukraine's Zerkalo Nedelya, which is a Russian language source and is independent. So the red lines here is the Russian state-controlled media, and the black lines are these independent sources. What we see is Russian media are actually covering Euromaidan protests roughly similarly to the independent source, up until we see these kind of neurotic spikes. You see this red? So they're really using words like federalization, Ruski, that is ethnic Russian, for some periods of time. But it's almost neurotic, because then by June they kind of fall into line with the other media. And look at referendum, for instance. They really seem to be concerned about holding referendum. February, it starts in February and kind of ends in June. So it's all very neurotic. And if you look at, okay, this chart is based on the scale of protests portrayed as disorder, violence, chaos, as opposed to protests as democratic citizen right. So similar kind of chart I've created as for the Russian media analysis, except that here we also have the black line, which is the independent media. So again, you see that they kind of go parallel, but in February something happens, and then there's this neurotic red dip here, when Russian media really aggressively kind of projecting all these stories about how, about the violence and chaos in occurring in Ukraine. But then again, it just starts going parallel with the other media. Of course, what happens in February, around the same time when we see that things start diverging, Yanukovych flees the country, and Russian media instantly reacts. So the operating words here are very quick tactical shifts, very quickly tactically responding to developments on the ground. And then, of course, sanctions kick in, the Malaysian airliner is down, and Russia starts already kind of disengaging, at least on the level of propaganda, from this kind of agenda of federalization in Ukraine. They also realize that the Donbass goes pear-shaped for them. It's not that kind of peaceful scenario that they thought would be like with the Crimea, where you get peaceful, friendly little green man. No, it really goes pear-shaped. And this is the divisions that happened also within the Russian elite, whereby within the Russian, Putin's entourage, some forces were encouraging him to continue engagement, like and Dugin refers to this, Russian nationalist thinker. Dugin referred to this disengagement as the April shift in Putin's strategy on Ukraine. And that's precisely the shift we observe in our media. So the shift came as a result of disagreements between Surkov and Glaziev, two kind of people in Putin's entourage. One of them, Glaziev, was urging for more engagement in the Donbass, and Surkov was arguably urging for more disengagement. What is happening in Russia itself? There's less appetite for the Crimea scenario. Lots of public support for Crimean annexation, but not so much support for the Donbass, because refugees from the war zone start flooding into Russian regions that are sort of close to, these on the border with Ukraine, And on this map, the dark shaded regions show regions that were mounting protests against Russia's involvement in Ukraine. So this was because of the refugees, but also because some Russian regions said, well, Russia wants Ukraine to federalize. Let's allow proper federalization in Russia itself. And finally, just some on the very latest, okay, just half a minute. So we're coming back to the Russian protests that lead up to these elections that just happened. I'll just show you the latest protest trends. And we see, if you look at the dark shaded as opposed to the lightly shaded lines, the dark shaded lines are socioeconomic protests. We see that during from 2012 up until 2014, it's the lightly shaded ones, that is the political protests against the regime that predominate. Later on, now we're observing socioeconomic protests. But who are blamed in these protests? If you look at these bar charts here, and this is all from NAMARS data, socioeconomic protests, most of the protests are blaming local and regional authorities or factory managers. They're not blaming the good czar in the Kremlin, which would be the dark bar here. So coming back to this question of vulnerability versus adaptability, I think the regime has been remarkably adaptable, whether it's framing foreign policy developments to serve its own domestic needs or its own kind of popular domestic protests. And in some ways, perhaps the manipulation of public opinion in combination with emasculating the political opposition worked in terms of, the people are not able to properly assign blame. They're blaming factory managers for their evils, not socioeconomic ills, the fridge issue that Vladimir Gelman has described. So they're not blaming the good czar in the Kremlin. So in that sense, perhaps the strategy of media manipulation in combination with repression has also worked. And that's what explains this kind of helps partly explain the remarkable popular passivity surrounding the elections that we observed. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, so next we'll turn to Regina Smyth of Indiana University. And for those of you standing around the back, there are a few seats kind of here and there throughout, so please don't be shy in making your way to them.
Okay, let me start my presentation with two caveats. One is that, as Volodya has already commented, this was a remarkable demonstration of strength for the regime. And within that context, though, I think there are some very interesting patterns of weakness. There are very interesting patterns of, or variation in the level of that strength. And that's what I want to focus on in this talk. And the second caveat I want to talk about or introduce my talk with is, I've become very concerned that we as a community of scholars studying Russia, and I'll bring this back to the beginning, have sort of endogenized our study to events. That is, we're sort of chasing events. And we're forgetting that we have a lot of tools sometimes, or we're adapting our tools to talk about new events without thinking about what it told us about old events. And I think this election is a return to the status quo in a lot of ways. One is that it looks very much like the 1990s with a different outcome. That is, we have the same electoral rule, we're observing a lot of the same strategies, you're seeing a lot of the same patterns of competition, except the state is better at mobilizing resources to take advantage of these things. And so I'm going back to work I did in the 1990s, where I looked carefully at candidates in these elections, because we actually see some candidate effects in the elections, look at what the parties are actually doing to get a sense of what co-opted opposition looks like, and also to look at regional variation, most importantly to look at regional variation in the outcomes. So my students and I have spent the last 3 days, 4 days, 5 days coding data. We've coded candidate biographies, we've mapped district characteristics with outcomes, and what I'm going to give you here is impressions from that work about having been immersed in the data. So here's the central question is that I want to talk about is, what does this outcome, and here I'm using the same compelling picture of overwhelming victory, tell us more generally about regime stability, and from the perspective of voters, from the perspective of what voters did and how regional machines look. And as I said, I'm going to look at these data. I'm going to look at candidate biographies, strategies and party programs, and ballot construction across regions and how it came out. So I thought that the goal of this election was going to be to squeeze out candidate effects. That is, to make candidates unimportant and make party labels very important. And in a sense that was true, except oddly in United Russia. So if you look at the candidate biographies of candidates in UR and other parties, it was like Snow White and the Dwarfs. There was one candidate with a lot of experience, with a lot of past work having been done in a lot of spheres, military and also in politics, military and also in business. There was a great deal of military presence among United Russian candidates. So, and in comparison with the opposition on the ballot, the opposition was very small. And as the students were coding the data, the students were saying, I would vote for the United Russia candidate. So there was a sort of sense of expertise among these folks that was important. There was also evidence of a political ambition and career ladder developing within United Russia. Most of those folks had lower level political experience or were promotioniki to sitting deputies. They were not new faces, and I think this speaks to the sort of, again, the neuroses or paranoia around the system. In the data that we have, the average age of United Russia candidates was somewhere between 55 and 60. These were not the fresh new faces that we expected to be presented with. And that, as Tomila pointed out this morning in our chat, may have something to do with the people you can trust are the people who have been around for a long time. The young, fresh faces were the other opposition on the ballot, right? The inexperienced opposition. So what does that say about the long-term viability of the party to rejuvenate and sustain itself? Well, not good things, right? And so perhaps it's worth a look, more attention to these questions. What can we say about the loyal core of voters? And I'm going to expand on this theme, but I want to start out by saying it looks like in most regions, not all, and I'm going to distinguish, the loyal core of voters for the regime in United Russia has dropped below 35%. Now that's a pretty low number relative to the outcome. So manipulation and fraud are playing a very significant role. And it underscores the gap between the evaluations of President Putin and the government and UR, and the persistence of that gap. It shows the difference between sort of pre-election opinion polls and electoral outcomes. Looks like 6, 7, 8% of the vote right before, so there's some variation there. And there's a big difference between the nature of the victory, the overwhelming nature of the victory, and the actual pattern of votes cast, right? Whereas the overwhelming nature paints the picture of extreme state strength, and the actual votes cast paints a picture of some weakness. Okay, who learns what? Well, voters learn that the state has an overwhelming capacity to produce outcomes. And therefore, they learn that disengagement, and here I'm going to disagree a little bit with what people have said about voters, that disengagement is a political strategy. When there is no choice and there's no effect that will come from voting, you don't vote, right? Now, disengagement is profoundly different from apathy. Apathy means you don't care. Disengagement means you don't see any effect in this voter, in this election, this particular election. And we have seen across the globe, and there's some new interesting work on disengagement strategies in Africa, that disengaged voters quickly re-engage when it looks like it's an important event, or it looks like their actions will have some effect. So I think it's important to think about this not as apathy, but as disengagement. As we've already heard, the impulse for post-election protest is extremely low here. So we'll see some small protests, tiki piquet and other things. But there will be no sort of cascade of participation because voters learned that there's little active opposition available and that the opposition that's there is very divided. So what is the point of protesting in this particular moment? The regime, on the surface, it looks like the best possible outcome for the regime, but I'm gonna suggest that there are some problems. National turnout was 46%, but regional turnout varied dramatically. And so that number is extraordinarily misleading. The non-systemic opposition the regime learns has been totally discredited at this point, at least the ones they let to run. That's a happy message for them, like a control message. And they learned that the systemic opposition is extraordinarily loyal and infinitely expandable. That is, if you look at the party platforms of these parties that were allowed on the ballot, they were very consistent with the United Russia story for the most part. They left out the most, Rodina, for example, leaves out most of its national rhetoric in articulating its views. It didn't push for its SMD candidates at all on its website or popular materials. So they were very controllable, right? And again, infinitely expandable. So co-optation is the way. However, we see in here what political scientists talk about as the dictator's dilemma. The dictator, the regime, no longer has the information that it used so effectively to organize the strategies that Tomila talks about and I'll talk about in a second. So what they learn from what happens is there's an effective system and which strategies sort of seem to work and didn't, and they learn where they have problems. This is the most important thing the regime learns. It learns where it has problems, right? And then, so why that's interesting is now we can look forward and say, how are they gonna respond to those problems differentially across these regions, right? But it has no clear sense of the real value of core support since most of it is mobilized. So these turnout rates in the United Russia vote rates are half mobilized and half sincere, or part mobilized and part sincere. We don't know what that mix looks like. The regime probably doesn't really know what that mix looks like. There's no sense of what voters want from these SMD candidates. It was largely an orchestrated performance. And the risk for the regime in the face of decreased information is increased in this period between elections. So here, again, I want to shift gears just a little and assess the outcome in terms of regional levels. I want to say that the variation in regional outcomes is more important than national strategies. And I also want to talk about the effectiveness of the electoral control system, this pattern of manipulation, vote turnout, and ballot construction, and assess it, at the regional level. I'll be very fast to wrap up. So here, here's the list just to illustrate of very high turnout regions, very low turnout regions. No one will be surprised about this. These have been recalcitrant or significant regions for a long time. Let me just point out, these are regions with over 70% turnout and often over 80% vote support. We cannot say that this is a free and fair election because on a national level, these votes are really shaping national outcomes. And that's an important thing to think about. Over here we have turnout of 20% or so, right? This is a strategy of compensation. UR wins, let's forget the slideshow. UR wins in two ways. It wins with very low turnout and very marginal victories, and it wins with overwhelming turnout and overwhelming victories. And that's a big variation. And the regions in which there's low turnout and low margins of voting are the problem places, right? And they are larger in number than the non-problematic places. And that's sort of the takeaway. So let me just conclude. Success, masterful manipulation, psychological warfare. Borisov wrote in his blog, the disenfranchisement of those less dependent on the state. They could vote for the opposition, but they chose not to in this round. But there's some interesting stuff that happens in Yablok's failure that I think the regime wasn't so happy about. continued reliance on punishment regimes in the republics that rely on infusions of money. The disengaged are not a permanent state, that they could quickly re-engage. And most of the gains here come from rule change, not a change in configuration of voter preferences or an increase in the power of regional machines. I would argue regional machines got less powerful over this period. Okay, sorry.
All right, thank you. So now we'll turn to Nikolay Petrov.
Could I please sit?
Yes.
Okay, thank you so much. I did wake up at 5 in the morning today with the idea that I do not agree with Vladimir, my good friend, and I should formulate why exactly. Perhaps if I would read Regina's paper, I would sleep calm, because I do agree with almost all of her conclusions. I think that what we see in the picture drawn by Volodya, it's almighty Kremlin, which got a lot of gains and which did not pay for getting these gains. And I think this is not exactly the case. To make the picture more sophisticated, I would add 3 more dimensions to his 3D picture. And my 4th D is dismantling of regional and partly corporate political machines, which is very important part of this story. My 5th D is districting, which is another very important part of this story. And my 6th D is defraudization. And I would say that in my view, elections were manipulated in many different ways. So the scale of manipulation did increase essentially, but the scale of fraud did decrease. And I would, well, try to describe the difference. Manipulation is technique used everywhere, including in American elections, and gerrymandering, which was used in districting, has been invented not in Putin's Russia, but this is considered to be more or less well, within certain rules of the game. And I would say that in my view, the Kremlin was trying to play within these rules of the game, and they did even call this election sterile elections, saying that, well, they did try at least to avoid any public scandals. And there are very different indicators telling that they are more or less, well, right in this. And let's wait the final conclusion of the OSCE observation mission, which did work, unlike in last elections, pretty well. And I think that their conclusion will be that elections used to be more free, but not fair. And well, there are no doubts about unfairness of these elections. Let me give a couple illustrations. Yes, there are 78 parties registered. 74 of them could participate in elections, but only 14 did participate actually, and this is due to the fact that these 14 parties were allowed to register their candidates without gathering signatures. Everybody else, all parties which did try to register candidates gathering signatures, did fail because their signatures were considered to be bad. And out of these 14 participants, 4 parties did manage to come to the Duma, plus 2 deputies from another 2 parties. And there is only, yeah, it's another interesting story about candidates in single mandate districts. There were more than 200 of them who did register, who did try to register without support of this or that political party, self-registering candidates. Only each 10th of them has been registered, and only 1 did win, and this one is the United Russia guy, Vladislav Reznik, corrupt guy, which, well, the United Russia decided that it would be better to let him to run not as the United Russia candidate, but in fact he was. So that's all. It means that, well, there was very strong selection at different stages of elections. In general, I would say that in my view, it's not that much about the Kremlin's learning from its mistakes, it's about Volodin's learning from Surkov's mistakes. And I do like this comparison Volodya made of 2011 and 2016 elections. And let me add a few things showing that the Kremlin was not in a good position this time. Social economic situation this time is much worse than it used to be in 2011, including perception of citizens. Trust in elites is much lower now. It's due to the fact that having no more carrots and using sticks, the Kremlin did arrest governors, and if governors are arrested, nobody will fulfill illegal orders coming from those governors who are governors today and who are prisoners tomorrow. And bad memories of 2011, not only within political society, but in the Kremlin. The only positive for the Kremlin thing was dismantling of the systemic observation of elections. And this is extremely important. Although there were crowds of observers this time, they were not well organized, they were much less numerous, so we can speak about lack of any real control over elections, which makes it easier to manipulate or even to have fraud in elections. Background, this is very interesting as well. Elections this time, and I think it's for the first time in Russian history, was not the single game in town and the most important game in town. So the general background when Putin was reshuffling Siloviki guys, when he did replace the head of staff a month before elections, and all these changes did attract much more attention and were, I think, much more important for the system than elections as such. So elections were not only non-visible in general, but not very important, at least at the surface. Districting, it's another very interesting story. For the first time, the Kremlin came with absolutely new scheme of districts when something like, say, 90 districts were absolutely new, and big regions were cut just like cakes, with regional center divided into 3, 4, 5 pieces, and each of these pieces being connected to countryside, which I think is very positive sign. First of all, gerrymandering is the sign of very well-developed political culture, like in the United States. And second, it did demonstrate that the Kremlin was eager to manipulate, to use administrative resources as much as possible, but to avoid any direct fraud. Direct fraud, I mean reporting about results without even counting ballots, or regardless of results of this counting. Okay. Next thing, cost-benefit analysis. This electoral victory, and we can congratulate Mr. Volodin and the Kremlin, did not come without price. And the price is pretty high. We did not mention primaries a lot, but primaries is a very important part of these elections. And primaries is, coming back of certain elements of public politics, of certain elements of competition. And primaries in many cases used to be much more competitive than elections as such. And what does it mean to use administrative resource? It's not the Kremlin which controls entirely administrative resource. Administrative resource is controlled by federal authorities, regional authorities, local authorities. And in many cases there was conflict between these three levels, and that's why it was not that easy to play this game. And we should say that there are not 4 parties in the State Duma, but there are 5 parties, and the 5th party is the party of single mandate deputies, who are very different from their comrades from the same party, because they do have much more complicated loyalty. They are much more connected not only to regional elites, to business elites, but to ordinary voters as well. And it will be very complicated to deal with this Duma. That's why Mr. Naryshkin is out and Mr. Volodin is, or will be, the new speaker of the Duma. So, and in my view, this is extremely important position. Volodin now should preside the modernization of party political system, which is extremely old-fashioned. We can speak that Putin stays in power for 16 years, but almost all party leaders do stay in power for 20 more years. these old dedushkas are not able, by the way, to participate in next elections. The Kremlin did not try to improve this system, to modernize it, but now it's time to do this. So I'm coming to what's next. What is very important, I think, it's huge gap between general and presidential elections. For the first time in Russia's history, it's more than 1 hour, 1 year and a half. Not only it's huge at a time when, due to economic crisis, the Kremlin needs some economic reforms, and all these economic reforms should be painful. So from one side, economic reforms are needed, from other side, they are absolutely impossible on the eve of presidential elections, which leads me to two bifurcation points, which we'll see, I hope, this year. One is whether it will be possible to find money to buy time and to stay without making any radical moves till 2018 scheduled presidential elections. And there is no other way to find money except to borrow money at the West, to improve relations with the West, and to lift part of sanctions. And I think that we'll see these efforts in a short while, immediately after your own elections. If only American elections will not make this task easier for Putin, for the Kremlin, then we'll see very serious U-turn and the attempt of the Kremlin to improve relations with the West. If it's impossible by the end of this year, and the Kremlin is very limited in time, then they should decide about early presidential elections. There is no other way to survive. After these early presidential elections, or after regular presidential elections, if you'll give money, Putin, then they should decide where to go. And there are two basic ways. I do not wait for any improvements with regard to civil society and so on. I'm waiting for either authoritarian modernization or full-scale authoritarian system. Both alternatives are not very much welcomed by political elites. That's why what Putin was doing effectively this year, it was pushing out all possible centers of elites consolidation, and now he does have a free hand. And a couple words more about Volodin. What makes his position now very privileged, it's the fact that this Duma has been formed and will survive presidential elections, all this reshuffling, and I would say transformation of the regime. So it can be seen as an island of stability, as a base from which all other changes will be made, and that's why I think that Volodin is very well paid for his very effective strategies and tactics in elections, and we'll see very essential shifts in the political party system, I think, this year, and very essential reshuffling in the state administration by the end of this year. Thank you.
Hey, terrific. Thank you all for, I think, very stimulating comments. Let's open up things for, open up to you all for questions, comments. I would just add one brief thing I'd like to hear at least some of you address, which would be the findings of Sergei Shpilkin, who actually I saw recently is going to be at Kennan Institute later this year, who was looking at patterns in turnout, who argues there was a wide, like a large-scale fraud in this election. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. So let's open it up. So please, let's see, just raise your hand, and I'll ask you to just please identify yourself and then ask the question. And before you pose your question, I think we should have mics. People have microphones? Right in the back, yes. So just wait for one to come to you. So, okay, first of all, Mark. I'll take a few before going back to the panel.
Okay. Okay, I have two questions.
You can identify yourself, please.
Mark Kramer from Harvard University. First would be the question of the moving up of the elections came up. you'll remember when they were moved up from December to September, and people argued then that the intent of that was to reduce turnout or some other thing. It's never been clear to me what exactly that intent was. That is, what's the difference between holding them in September and December concretely? Would it really make a difference if they were, a few months later? I didn't understand that when it came up this morning, and I didn't understand it when it was discussed earlier. The other question, which picks up on what Kolya got to at the end, is if you were to look contextually at the two situations in December 2011 and September 2016, you would find that inherently there would be probably a greater proclivity to protest now than 5 years ago, because the economy over the last couple of years has been in dismal shape, and having been in Russia a lot this year, I can attest that people are very dissatisfied with it in Moscow, but even more so outside Moscow. And so if you were to go back to December 2011, I mean, the economy wasn't outstandingly vibrant, but it did seem to have recovered pretty well from the sharp decline in 2009, and seemed to have stabilized, and so at least in that regard, people weren't as dissatisfied as they certainly seem to be now with that state of things. Yet starting with Volodya and continuing on, you have.
Maybe briefly, sir.
Yes, no, I'll conclude, Henry. You've argued why there hasn't been a recurrence of the 2011-2012 protest, despite, again, the appearance that in the Gaussian distribution, the tails, don't match expectations. I mean, they were much higher than they should have been. And so that's what I'm wondering is, could you give me a reason then that or a more extended explanation of why there haven't been protests now, because I didn't find it in what you were presenting to me. I would have expected now a much higher likelihood than I would have in 2011.
Okay. Georgi? Yes, we have a comment. Yes.
Georgi Derlugan, New York University, Abu Dhabi. Mostly to Nikolay, because what he mentioned towards authoritarian modernization is just too important to leave it between us two. What is possible? I'm not asking you to project what they want to do, but what is possible? And this is of course another question to all of you. Gerrymandering is part of it. Something happening with the state apparatus, but what is at all possible? Because the authoritarian modernization, which we know historically have been export-oriented, in the situation of sanctions, could it be another reliance on the former Soviet republics? It did not work for most of Arab presidents of life, but it did work spectacularly in East Asia. So what is possible?
Okay, I think maybe if we have time for one more question, we can go back to the panel. Yes. Yeah, we need the mic up here. Thanks.
Yulia Nikitina, MGIMO University. I have a question to Tomila. So your last slide was about protests in some regions and the reasons for those protests. So it seems like you believe that there is something wrong with blaming local authorities and not Vladimir Putin. So could you please develop this idea? Thank you.
Okay, so let's go back to the panelists. We'll just go in the order in which you spoke. And especially, I think if you were addressed by another panelist, it'd be interesting to hear your response on that too. So.
Yeah. Thanks for critical comments and responses. Actually, I would say that the difference depends upon our perceptions, whether the glass is half full or half empty. The most important issue is the difference raised by Regina about apathy and disengagement. yeah, we can perceive disengagement as some sort of temporary state of affairs and expect that if something important will happen, then disengaged voters will be back to the stage. The point is that there should be someone who will bring these voters back to the stage. And from this perspective, Kremlin is very consistent and as of yet successful in diminishing possibilities for anti-regime electoral mobilization. It not necessarily means that mobilization will not occur in non-electoral means. And my guess that might be that some new protests will arise regardless to elections and not related directly to them, even though elections is a focal point for any forms of mobilization, whether or not they're related to fraudulent elections or to something else. And this is partly a response to Mark's excellent comment. Yet, actually, the situation in Russia in September 2016 is much more, how to say, conductive for popular protests than it was 5 years ago, when people responded to perceptions of electoral fraud, and yet this year electoral fraud was comparable with those of 2011, even though it was conducted in a different way, and mostly happens in those areas where there were no major protests 5 years ago. By and large, many observers considered that elections in Moscow and St. Petersburg were not so fraudulent as they were 5 years ago. But the problem is that protests not happen just out of air. There should be someone who will frame the information, who will address this information to the public, and who will mobilize this public against the regime. This is a function which was used through social media, through independent media outlets, and even reached state-led media outlets 5 years ago. Now the information landscape, as you may judge partly by Tomila's presentation, was completely different. Now those who mobilized angry voters 5 years ago were less active because of efforts of the state, and therefore even potentially higher demand for protests not met, or how to say, supply of protest organizers. It not necessarily means that the picture we observed is once and forever, but we should take more focus on actors, on agencies, not just on objective conditions. Thank you.
Yes, I'll pick up on both. I think both Mark's and Julia's questions regarding. Can you hear me now? In terms of yes, my data actually show that socioeconomic types of protests are on the rise, and these trends are very clear. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to go into the data, but we distinguish between political protests, that are protests in which the protesters are kind of targeting the regime directly, as in Россия без Путина would be clearly coded as a political protest, where the regime is the target for blame attribution, as opposed to protests that are socioeconomic, where, for instance, protesters, and that is happening across Russia now, or increasingly, where protesters are simply desperate because they haven't been paid for several months, and their wages haven't been paid. People stage hunger strikes, that is on the rise, and those are the kind of wage, bread and butter type issues are increasingly motivating people to protest. What we are not seeing is blame attribution that would link these kind of grievances to the policies of the regime, and that's why social movement literature kind of emphasizes the importance of leadership and clever blame attribution strategies that would make these links and thereby organize the people. What we're not seeing is kind of organization also across Russian regions. These are isolated socioeconomic protests, and that is very different from 2011, 2012, where people converged on Moscow, St. Petersburg, major regional capitals, and their slogans were Russia without Putin, and they kind of linked the policy failures to the regime. We are not seeing that. So that's why the regime has been very clever in kind of emasculating the opposition. That would help in kind of that mobilization and blame attribution component that would kind of help create something like a movement of the kind that we observed in December 2011, 2012. And also on Mark's question about the why September, why were the elections held in September? I would think some analysts have speculated is to create low turnout. Now, low turnout is actually bad public relations for the regime. I think it was more about keeping people, protesters, off the streets because, this is the start of the school season. I don't know if it's still considered as the dacha season, but so I think not so much turnout, but this kind of mobilization and protest capacity was what motivated more the regime in terms of shifting the dates, the date of the election.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
So having done a lot of work on 2011-12 protests, let me just reiterate what Tomila is saying, which is that the catalyst for protest, first of all, protest is an extraordinarily rare event in the world, and so it's difficult to predict. But protests have different catalysts. In the case of 2011-2012, it was a very targeted type of appeal that had to do with votes being stolen, clear votes being stolen, and people who had voted and their votes were stolen went to the street. What they learned was that the system was manipulated, right? In this election, the way it's been framed by the state, there's no such consensus that there was massive manipulation or a great deal of, and even in the way that we're talking about things here, it sneaks in, right? We're sneaking in, we're comparing the very manipulated election of 2008, that's in fact the very fraudulent election of 2008, the election in 2011, we're just comparing one fraudulent election to another, sort of normalizing across them, right? Fraud is a steady state. So it was a different catalyst, Mark, the political, and this distinction between political...
Regina, the regime didn't portray the 2011 elections as fraudulent. That was the
right, the people who went out onto the streets did,
yeah.
Right? And the information cascade came both from YouTube, but also from personal communications of people who were talking to other people saying, we didn't vote for them, who voted for them, right? Remember, it was tens of thousands of people, it was not millions of people. It's a different sort of thing. But it was very much, and I think this is really important, I want to underscore it strongly, Russians generally don't believe that these socioeconomic protests are political. So Steve Crowley's telling us strikes and economic protests are increasing. Your data shows us that protest is increasing. Protests about historic preservation, environmental concerns, all of that is increasing. But Russians don't feel it's political. Right, and so they're two different catalysts. And I think what's really important now that elections don't matter and are totally controlled is whether or not we see more behavior being channeled into these non-political protests. And I think that's interesting. I think it's also interesting that, Volodya talks about people needing leaders, but events can easily trigger protest too. We've seen this in Hong Kong. Policy decisions, political events, catastrophes can also trigger protests. And this is the new risk, I think. This is the increased new risk. Let me say just very, very briefly something about fraud, because I've been thinking about this. And I think the question should be, and probably Nikolay has something to say about this, the question should be, is the fraud in the republics big enough to be producing these results? So what mathematically is actually producing the result that Shpilkin sees? And I don't have a concrete answer for that, but I suspect that a lot of what he's observing can be accounted for outliers within the punishment regimes of the republics. But I'm not sure.
Maybe even what cost.
I'm not sure it accounts for 12 billion votes. That's the question for us right now.
Nikolay.
Well, it's interesting. Yesterday I was questioned by David Kramer. Now I'm trying to respond, Mark. Why elections are early? I do offer you 4 different explanations. One is, well, the simplest one, to put the Kremlin into a more advantageous position, to make it easier to control the Duma. Another one is the Kremlin is not interested now in high Duma's legitimacy and thus in high turnout. So the position with regard to these elections was let them pass and without public scandals, and that's all. And this is connected to the nature of new Putin's legitimacy, which is not electoral, and electoral legitimacy is not welcomed. The third explanation is to precede adoption of highly unpopular budget and perhaps Putin's U-turn in politics. It would be easier first to elect the Duma and then to let this Duma to vote for the budget, which will be very painful. And the fourth explanation is to serve as preparation to the early presidential elections. And unlike in Kazakhstan, where every election is early, in Russia this is for the first time, and I would not take that easily the explanation that it was done in order to make Volodin's job easy and to let him to get results. This was not entirely focused on the Duma and on electing the Duma. Speaking about protest, Regina did use chemical term catalyst many times. Let me add one more thing from political chemistry. In order for reaction to be fast, you should make a lot of small particles. And last time in 2011 elections, there was huge number of observers who were faced by this ugly behavior of authorities. And it's due to them, not that much due to somebody like Navalny who would claim to go to streets and so on, that there was mass protest. It wasn't connected in general with election results. Who cares how many communists or how many liberal Democrats are in the State Duma? In general, behavior of the Duma will be similar. It will be more complicated for Volodin to deal with single mandate deputies now, but that's all. There is no difference for vote in results, but the very fact that many 100,000 Russians who were observers last time and who were not observers this time were faced directly by this behavior of authorities. It was very important reason why this protest took place in 2011. Now let me switch to results. Of course there was fraud. In Russia, in order to avoid fraud, you should put Volodin's commissars, if he does want not to have fraud, everywhere, because automatically there will be large-scale fraud. We should have in mind that it wasn't only general election. In 39 regions, in half of Russia's regions, there were regional assemblies elections. And if there used to be fraud in regional elections, how to avoid fraud in federal elections? So it's absolutely natural, first thing. And second, it's due to having regional elections, gubernatorial and regional assemblies elections. Now, let's look at what the Kremlin was doing and what was the control over this fraud. First of all, observers were fewer, public observation was fewer, and it's much more complicated. It's not even about numbers. It's about impossibility to come to the polling station without letting them know in advance. That's why it was easier to prepare more or less free elections where observers should come, and to undertake any fraud where observers are not allowed to come and were not waiting. CIC, and this is very important issue, not only it was, well, how is it called, pig lipstick or?
On a pig, lipstick on a pig.
Yeah, lipstick on a pig, I mean Pamfilova instead of Churov. Sorry. But it did act very seriously. It did remove several heads of regional electoral commissions, and the Kremlin and Volodin in particular were paying a lot of attention to avoid large-scale early voting. And let's look at these figures. They are very different from what they used to be. So their idea was to demonstrate that they can win by landslide, even playing by all these rules of the game. And if to speak about Shpilkin, well, it's a little bit math trick. We should understand that there are different models describing electoral behavior and electoral choice. One model works in Moscow and St. Petersburg. In ethnic republic, it's not necessarily fraud. It's absolutely different motivation. They do not care about whether the United Russia or Communist Party will get this or that percentage of votes. They are much more focused on their direct relationship with their local boss. And if the boss is saying something, it's not like say, well, it's very special kind of fraud, because they are waiting for instructions how to vote, and they can vote by these instructions because it's much more important for them to keep good relations with their immediate boss in countryside, in every region of Russia, than to express their political preferences in such a way. And all these differences do have very different mathematical descriptions, so I would not necessarily believe that this simplified idea that you should look at the distribution and easily decide whether there was large-scale fraud or there wasn't large-scale fraud, it does work in such an easy way. Thank you.
Thank you. Actually, Tomila wanted to make a comment on the Shpilkin.
Actually, unfortunately, because I ran out of time, I didn't have time to show the last slide, in which I was actually promoting a paper that I just published with a co-author, Rodion Skovrda, in Post-Soviet Affairs. I've got a free e-print link that I can send you, and it's on fraud, analyzing fraud in Russia's 2012 presidential elections. And what we found is that the kind of the old-fashioned ballot stuffing type fraud correlates with the reports by Golos, which is Russia's NGO that kind of crowdsources reports of irregularities of all kinds. And what we find that there was a statistically significant correlation between the kind of Shpilkin type, mathematical ways of basically writing in made-up numbers in precinct return sheets, and this kind of crowdsourced data about different kinds of manipulations that could be of the kind that you described, where the factory boss gathers the employees and says, you vote this way, and or type of fraud where election monitors simply report suspicious, bags and or ballots being counted behind closed doors without monitors being let in. So I urge you to actually look at the Golos data for these elections, because as with previous elections, they've come up with Karta Narusheni. It's a map of irregularities that has regional distribution, and if you click on each, unfortunately, again, I was going to pull it out in my presentation, but ran out of time. But they've got little red balloons, so if you click on those balloons, you will see the regions in which manipulations have been reported and what kind they are. And I urge you to pay attention, to take both the Golos type reports and the Shpilkin type analysis seriously, because I suspect, again, in this election they will correlate, and again, there is a lot more happening, a lot of fraud and manipulations were happening. And on ethnic republics, I should say that in our analysis, Nikolay, Dagestan was such an outlier that we had to exclude it from our analysis, and that's for mathematics. It's not the kind of factory boss or collective farm boss talking to his employees saying you vote this way. It's really about writing in made up numbers. So it was that kind. And what we find is that oftentimes different types of manipulations and fraud are used together to augment the overall result.
Great, thank you. All right, so let's take another round of input, comments, questions. Yes, please. It's over here. Just again, ask you to identify yourself, please.
Thank you. Mikhail Zolan, Regional Studies Center. I have a question to whoever panel participants who would like to address that. I think for all people who watch Russia closely, it's a puzzle why the liberal opposition and the non-systemic opposition fails every time in the elections to gain a significant number of votes. Obviously, people who support that opposition, they are a minority in Russia, but they're a quite vocal minority and quite, well, probably they are a larger minority than the results of the election show. So what is your explanation? Why in this particular election the results of parties like Yabloko were so low?
Okay. Other? Yes, please. Corey over here.
Thanks. Corey Weld, PONARS and now CRS. I wanted to get back to the question that Regina had, the issue that Regina, you had raised about the same faces, or familiar faces that is, in United Russia. And I wanted to ask, how significant was the turnover within the Duma? Are these familiar faces that have been sitting in parliament, or are they familiar faces from elsewhere? And I also wanted to ask generally, do any of the panelists see a relationship between Levada Center being branded as a foreign agent and the timing of the elections, or are these rather separate processes?
Okay, good. Any other? Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you. Marie Lipman, Counterpoint Magazine Journal. It's a comment rather than a question, actually two. And one is to Regina, and this is about apathy and disengagement. And I think the difference is rather artificial. If it were a disengagement in spite of the government seeking to mobilize the people and come to the polls would be one thing. What we were dealing with this election was a government that, in a quite artful way, discouraged, and this will be a seventh D probably to the list of Ds, discouraged the unwelcome voters and encouraged the welcome voters. So the disengagement was man-made, and as in an old Soviet joke, we know the name of that man. We know who wanted them to be disengaged. Of course, they can re-engage, but this is not an internal, psychological, however you describe it, process within the society. It's what the government wanted. Another thing has to do with the comparison of fraud in 2011 and 2016. Why not look farther behind? 2009, Moscow election, very heavily rigged. This is a Moscow election, not a national one. So you would think the most active, vocal, sophisticated constituency. Public opinion polls showed before the election in Moscow that people expected fraud, and after the election they believed there had been fraud. No protest whatsoever. Those who protested against that fraud were communists who protested by working out in the National Duma because of what happened to them in Moscow. So my hypothesis is that a lot of this has to do with the public atmosphere. And back to the comparison of 2011 and 2016, the public atmosphere was tremendously different back then. The sense of empowerment among the educated urbanites or hipsters, however you call them, wonderful mood, a sense of we can that throughout the rise of civic activism. And then I would like to support what Nikolay said about, it was the observers, people who confronted not just fraud, but mistreatment by the police, rough treatment by the police, who drove the protests. The protests, and this is something to answer our Mark's questions, the protests in 2011 and 2012 were, the atmosphere, the mood was, it was cool to be there. It was fun to be there. It was not a protest driven out of deep grievances, were stripped of their livelihood. It was fun to be in the square. It was fun to be together. There is absolutely nothing like that in Russia today. And I think this factor of the public atmosphere prior to the election, that is a very important factor here.
Okay, I think this will be the last round of input, so do we have any more comments or questions before we return to the panel?
Many votes is totally connected with the fact that there was nationalist blogger Vladislav Maltsev who did represent PONARS in debates, and he was saying all the time Putin should be impeached, and that's all. So he was recognizable. The first number of the list was Mikhail Kasyanov, very dull bureaucrat who is acceptable for elites but who is absolutely unattractive. And the third number was Andrei Zubov, the professor in style of pre-revolutionary Russian times, who is very nice to speak to, but who cannot attract any number of voters. So another point is that we should not take elections in Russia too seriously, because I think political scientists do speak about these elections much more than voters or citizens do pay attention to elections. Elections is a kind of entertainment, political show. If there is no direct consequences for real politics, then you should support those guys who can entertain you better than others. And Zhirinovsky is a good example. That's all. So elections are over, and everybody else except for Volodin should forget about elections. And that's why liberals who are dull, who are not very impressive, who does not have, by the way, who do not have a lot of opportunities to demonstrate themselves. Perhaps if they would have these opportunities, their results would be lower. That's why we should not take this as real failure of liberal ideas in Russia. What is important, I think, that very serious portion of voters is absolutely not represented at the new State Duma and will create some troubles. Big cities are not represented in the Duma almost absolutely. And they...
Okay, in that case, let's go back in the order that we started with. So.
Why liberal opposition got so few votes? Actually, the government did a tremendous job on diminishing influence of the opposition by using various ways, ranging from exclusion of some potential candidates in one way or another. I mean, first and foremost, the murder of Boris Nemtsov, which greatly benefited the government, to encouraging certain internal schisms, scandals, and the like, which made already weak opposition even more weak. But also, I would say that what Regina stated about United Russia, that okay, these are the same people who just grew up old and old but hold power, to some extent may be true with regard to the opposition. Two leading opposition parties were run by Yavlinsky and Kasyanov, who certainly represented the period of the past, and they hold their jobs, but frankly speaking, it would be much better if some new faces could appear instead. And given that, the previous tendency when opposition was pushed into a very narrow ghetto before 2011 was simply restored, similarly to reappearance of United Russia. So from this perspective, it was also a restoration of pre-2011 status quo for the opposition,
which for a number of reasons was not able to get major benefits from this wave of protest in 2011-2012. I wouldn't blame the opposition first, but certainly the government was much more efficient in this conflict. And turning back to what already been stated about Levada Center, actually it was not an opposition. And I wouldn't say that any data produced by Levada could challenge election outcome in one way or another. It's just an illustration that the government would like to exclude any kind of unwelcomed information, even though this information not much challenge the status quo. It was kind of pressure over needs, but I cast no doubt that it was an immediate reaction on expectations demonstrated by Levada surveys about major decline of voter turnout and of potential regime support.
Thank you. I just maybe could pick up on Maria's point about the change in atmosphere, which I would fully agree with. The question is the question is whether this change in atmosphere and to what extent it has been fabricated with the use of those media propaganda techniques that I talked about in my presentation. It's not cool to be a kind of liberal protester. Maybe it's more cool to be a patriot and kind of Russian Kremnash type, kind of, because that kind of discourse is now very much has influenced public opinion, I think. And I don't think we should underestimate that element of kind of manufactured public opinion that in turn disincentivizes the kinds of protests that we saw in 2011, 2012.
So this is the puzzle, right? There are opposition parties on the ballot. There are non-systemic opposition parties on the ballot, and they get no vote. And I don't have a great answer, except that they were bad choices, right? They're not effective choices. They're not people like. I do think that Yabloko poses a very interesting issue here. So there were some signs of cooptation around Yabloko. Maybe you all will disagree with me, but I thought that Putin actually wanted Yabloko to support PAS or would be willing to tolerate it, because the policy, and this is why, it's a small point, but I think it's an interesting one. In the television ads that were playing back to back, it was always United Russia and then Yabloko. So they were being put forward sort of almost together, right? Secondly, in points where Yabloko got in trouble in registering and being on the list, the Kremlin and CEC jumped in, right? And the last is that several of my students were at the Yabloko Party Conference in June, where they were hearing talks about working within the regime, finding new ways to cooperate, not collaborate in the same way, but new ways to cooperate, that maybe they could go inside. So obviously that didn't do anything for them, and maybe discredit them, I don't know. But I think it's a question that deserves more attention, right? I agree with you. Let me say the same thing to go back to the public atmosphere and the apathy. All of this is about the question for voters about what you expect other people to do. What is it you expect other people to do? There was nothing in this environment, and it partly because of the state, but partly because there was no good choice, and partly because they had tried last time and had been defeated. There was no good sense that other people were going to take action. And I think that's the disengagement. The signal for disengagement is you don't believe others are going to take action. So for now, you're also not gonna take action, but if that belief changes, you will go. And that's why the public atmosphere, the discussion, the liveliness of the discussion, the constant chatter on social media, but also on buses and subways is so important, right? Because individuals are forming beliefs about what others will do. There was nothing to counter the Kremlin's belief that everybody was gonna stay home. Everybody was gonna stay home. And I think that's the difference. I think the public atmosphere and also the state message were reinforcing each other. And they weren't independent. Obviously, the state has some responsibility, but I think that's what I want to say about that without going.
Okay, and Nikolay.
I would agree with almost everything, and I would first of all say that it should be more surprising how much the liberal opposition got rather than how bad are their results. And by the way, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, three parties which could be considered to be liberal opposition, Yabloko, PONARS, and Party of Growth, they got 15 to 20% of votes, and Yabloko did manage to establish its factions in less than a dozen of regional assemblies. But I think, well, another point, if they would come to the State Duma, I think it would be not that good, by the way, because we should look at these guys to understand that, well, the party Congress was the single element of Yabloko's campaign, which was very impressive and very well done. They brought 10 guys at the top of the federal list from different parts of the, not necessarily from Yabloko, like Vladimir Ryzhkov and Dmitry Gudkov, and it was very impressive. Campaign itself was absolutely unimpressive because it was Yavlinsky, not these guys who did represent Yabloko. In case of PONARS, the reason they got that violate the scenario which was written and pretty well realized by him.
Okay, before we thank our panelists, I just want to say that for the next session, we'll first have a coffee break, and then the next session will begin at 11:15, and it will be a breakout session, so we'll have two going simultaneously. In this room, there'll be a panel on Russia's strategic outlook with Sam Cherov, Dmitry Gorenberg, Mikhail Riktik, and Mikhail Troitsky, and Paulina Sinoviets. And then upstairs in the stateroom, so basically if you kind of go upstairs and it's on this side of the building, will be the panel on economy and society in Eurasia with Andrew Barnes, Natalie Cook, Eric McGlinchey, Georgi Derlugian, and Ted Gerber. So unless there's anything else, we should have, okay, yeah, and so that's right, coffee is upstairs by the stateroom, so there's more room up there. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a great way to get